When Ahumado saw the small hole in his leg, with the little ring of rot around it, he knew that Parrot had been at work. Parrot had sent the small brown spider who hides to bite him. When he first saw the hole, which was in the lower part of his leg, he was surprised. He had always been respectful of Parrot, as he had of Jaguar. It was hard to know why Parrot would have the spider who hides bite him, but the evidence was there. When Ahumado bent over, he could smell the rot, and he knew it would get worse. Soon he might have no leg. He might merely have a bone where the leg had been. The flesh of his leg would rot and turn black. Parrot liked to joke. What had happened might only be Parrot's joke. Parrot was older than humans and had no respect for them. He was capable of complicated jokes, too. The whites had always called Ahumado the Black Vaquero, despite the fact that he had no interest in cows. He only bothered taking them to annoy the Texans, who prized cows highly. He didn't like horses either, except to eat, yet the whites considered him a great horse thief, though he only stole horses to trade them for slaves. Still, all the whites called him the Black Vaquero. Parrot knew such things. So now Parrot had sent Spider Who Hides to make his leg black. It was one of Parrot's jokes, probably. The Black Vaquero would at least have a black leg. Ahumado did not reveal his injury to anyone. He sat on his blanket, as he always did, watching the great vultures soar across the face of the yellow cliffs. There were fewer vultures now, because Ahumado had stopped hanging men in the cages, men the vultures could eat. Only a few of the vultures or the eagles still flew along the cliff, waiting to see if Ahumado would cage a man for them to eat. Ahumado sat as he had always sat, listening, saying little. The wound in his leg was very small yet. No one had noticed it or smelled the rot that would soon spread. Once he had thought the matter over for a day or two, Ahumado realized that it was more than just one of Parrot's jokes. Parrot had sent Spider to call him home. Parrot and Jaguar wanted him to leave the Yellow Cliffs, to stop harrying the whites with their thin cattle. Parrot and Jaguar wanted him to return to his home, to the jungle, where great serpents rested in the vine-covered temples. There was a broad tree near one of the temples, a tree with a great hole in it. Lightning had hit the tree and burned it away inside, so that there was a space in the tree large enough for a person to live in. When Ahumado was young, an old woman had lived in the tree. Her name was Uatl, and she was a great curandera, so great that she could even cure the bite of the Spider Who Hides. In his youth, Ahumado had often seen old Uatl. She lived in the split tree near his home. She had told him that he would live long, but that in his old age it would be his duty to return to the place of the split tree. When it was time for him to finish with his life as a human being, he was to lie near the tree with the hole in it. Then he would sink into the earth and become a root. Lightning would come again and burn the great tree where Uatl lived. That tree would burn up, but another tree would grow from the root that had once been the man Ahumado. That tree would live for 1,000 years and become the tree of medicines. The people would come in their weakness or illness to the tree of medicines and be cured. In that tree would be all knowledge, all that Uatl and all the other great healers knew. For 3 days Ahumado watched the tiny hole in his leg become larger. He watched as the ring of rot spread. On the 3rd day he heard a sound deep in his ear, and looked up to see Parrot fly like a red streak across the face of the cliff. He thought the sound in his ear was from Jaguar, who was somewhere near. Ahumado knew then that he had been summoned. He was spending his last day in the canyon of the Yellow Cliffs. None of the people in the camp knew this, of course. The women went on with their work, washing clothes in the stream and making tortillas. The men played cards, drank tequila, quarreled over dice, and tried to get the women to couple with them. Skull crouched in his cage, sheltering his lidless eyes from the sun. It was hundreds of miles to the jungle, to the place of temples. Ahumado knew he had better get started. He wanted to get across the first mountains before his leg became too bad. He knew that by the time he reached the home of Jaguar, he would have no leg. He meant to take a good hatchet with him so he could make himself a crutch when his leg failed. That night he would crawl through a hole that only he knew about. The hole would take him through the belly of the cliff. It would take him past the dark men. He told no one. He would merely vanish. In the morning there would be no Ahumado. He would travel over rocks and leave no track. None of the people would know where he went. He would simply be gone. There was only one thing left for Ahumado to do in the canyon of the Yellow Cliffs, and it involved old Goyeto, the skinner. "Sharpen your knives," he told Goyeto. "You had better get them as sharp as you can. They need to be very sharp today." Goyeto brightened when he received those instructions. They had taken no captives lately. There had been no one to skin. But now Ahumado wanted him to make the knives sharp. He wanted the knives to be very sharp. It must mean that he had at last decided to let him skin the white man's skull. There was no one else who was a candidate for skinning. So Goyeto set about to make his little knives sharp. While Ahumado sat on his blanket, Goyeto whetted his knives with skill. When they were ready, he brought them to Ahumado, who tested them one by one. He used fine threads from his blanket, cutting the threads with the mere touch. "Are we going to skin the white man?" Goyeto asked. "I'll have him tied to the post if you want." When Ahumado turned to face him, Goyeto's heart almost stopped from the look that was in Ahumado's eyes. Goyeto did not even have the strength to stammer. He knew he had been discovered. An old sin, one he had committed many years before with one of Ahumado's women on a blanket amid the horses, had been found out. Goyeto had long feared discovery. Ahumado was jealous of his women, but Ahumado had been 100 miles away on a trip to catch slaves when the woman coaxed him onto the blanket. She was a lustful woman. She had tried to coax him onto the blanket many times, but Goyeto had been too fearful of Ahumado's vengeance. He had only coupled with the woman that once. When Ahumado turned his snake-like look on him, Goyeto knew who the knives had been sharpened for. He jumped up and tried to run, but the vaqueros quickly caught him. At Ahumado's command, they took all his clothes off and tied him to the post where he had practiced his delicate art for so long. Goyeto felt such a fear that he wanted to die. No one but himself knew how to skin a man. If one of the crude young pistoleros tried to skin him, it would just be butchery. They would hack his flesh off with his skin. Then Ahumado himself rose from his blanket and took the knives. He stuck them one by one into the post above Goyeto's head, so that as one became dull he could take another. "Parrot told me what you did with my woman," Ahumado said. "He told me in a dream. I have watched you skin people for many years. I am your pupil in this matter. Now we will see if I have learned well." Goyeto didn't plead. He was so frightened that all words left his mind and became screams. Ahumado began at his armpits and began to work downward. Old Goyeto had a big stomach. Ahumado thought such a stomach would be easy to skin, but it wasn't. Goyeto screamed so loudly that people became confused and began to flee the camp. It was not merely the loudness of the screams that confused them either. Ahumado was skinning the skinner. No one knew what it meant. It might mean that he was tired of them, that he meant to skin them all. If they ran, he might merely shoot them, which would be better than being skinned. Goyeto's voice wore out long before Ahumado worked downward to the parts that had been active in committing the sin years before on the horse blanket. Goyeto's mind broke. He spewed liquids out of his mouth that mixed with his blood. Ahumado tried to skin one of his ears, but Goyeto didn't feel it. He died in the afternoon, well before the sun touched the rim of the yellow cliff. Disappointed, Ahumado stuck all of Goyeto's skinning knives in him and walked away. There were only a few people left in the camp by then, a few old women too crippled to run, and one or two of the older vaqueros. All of them hated Goyeto and wanted to see how long he would last. Like Ahumado, they were disappointed. The other person left was the white man, Skull. He had not watched the skinning. It was a bright day. He had to crouch with his arms over his head to keep the brightness from burning his brain. Skull knew what happened, though. Ahumado had seen him glance once or twice at the skinning post. Skull noticed that people were leaving the camp. It was only when dusk fell and deep shadows filled the canyon that Skull could look. Ahumado had returned to his blanket. A few old women sat by the fires. In the night, when the camp slept, Ahumado went to the cage where Skull was kept. Skull flashed his white eyes at him but didn't speak. Neither did Ahumado. Goyeto, dead, hung from the skinning post. Even some of the old women had begun to hobble away. Ahumado pulled the cage, with Skull in it, toward the pit of snakes and scorpions, and without delay pushed it over the edge. He heard it splinter when it hit the floor of the pit. There was no sound from Skull, but Ahumado heard the buzz of several rattlesnakes as he walked away. Ahumado took his rifle and his blanket and moved quickly until he found the hole that led through the belly of the mountain. By morning, when old Sitla woke and began to stir the campfire, the vultures had begun to curl down into the camp to feast on Goyeto. But Ahumado, the black vaquero, was gone. As Skull listened to old Goyeto's screams, he wondered what had occurred. The skinner was being skinned, that much he could see, although he only glanced up once or twice. He could not risk more, not with the sun so bright. But Ahumado was doing the skinning, and to judge from the intensity of Goyeto's screams, doing it badly on purpose. Where the skinner, Goyeto, had only taken skin, Ahumado pulled away strips of flesh, and did it so cavalierly that Goyeto soon wore out his voice and his heart. He died well before sunset, only partially skinned. Once the shadows came, Skull could risk more looks. He saw that almost all the people in the camp were leaving, unnerved by the unexpected execution of Goyeto. Then, once it was dark, Ahumado suddenly appeared and began to push the cage toward the pit. He didn't speak. Skull didn't either. The two had contested in silence so far. Let it stay silent, Skull thought, though he was disturbed by what was occurring. He had seen men hurled into the pit and had heard their dying screams. He didn't know how deep the pit was. Perhaps he would be killed or crippled by the drop. He knew there were snakes in the pit because he could hear them buzzing, but he didn't know how many snakes or what else might be there. Once Ahumado appeared, there was no time to reflect or plan. Ahumado didn't even glance at him or speak words of hatred and triumph. He just pushed the cage a few feet and without ceremony shoved it over the edge of the pit. The darkness Skull fell into was soon matched by the darkness in his head. He heard snakes buzzing, and then he heard nothing. The cage turned in the air, he landed upside down, and struck his head sharply on one of the wooden bars. When he came to, it was night. In the moonlight he could see the opening of the pit above him. Skull didn't move. He heard no buzzing, but didn't consider it prudent to move. If there was a snake close by, he didn't want to disturb it. In the morning he could assess matters more intelligently. There was dried blood on his cheek. He assumed he had cut his head when the cage hit bottom. But he was alive. At the moment his worst affliction was the stench. The rich Mexicans who had died in the pit were still there, of course, and they were fragrant. But he was alive, Bible and sword. Under the circumstances, phenomenal luck. It could easily have been himself and not Goyeto at the skinning post. The pistoleros, the vaqueros, the young men of the camp, and the young women seemed to have gone. Always at night there would be singing around the campfires. There would be laughter, quarrels, the sounds of flirtation, drunkenness, strife. Sometimes guns were fired. Sometimes women shrieked. But now the camp above him was silent, a fact which bothered Skull considerably. To be alive after such a drop was exhilarating, but after relief and euphoria came terrible thoughts. What if they had all left? The old man might just have pushed him into the pit and left him to starve. The walls of the pit looked sheer. What if he couldn't scale them? What would he survive on? What if no rains came and he had no water? From exhilaration he slid toward hopelessness. He had to will himself to stop, to collect his thoughts. Intelligence, he told himself. Think! The fact that he was in a hard situation didn't mean the final doom was come. At least in the pit he could shade himself, and the rangers might well be on their way with the cattle. With Ahumado gone, all they would have to do was ride in and hoist him out of the pit. Slowly, Skull's panic subsided. He reminded himself that in the pit there was shade. The torture of sunlight would be avoided. Finally, a gray light began to filter into the air above the pit. The stars faded. Skull looked first for the snakes and saw none. Perhaps they were hiding in crevices. The dead men were far gone and rot. Fortunately, his cage had splintered, and he soon freed himself of it. The stench all but overcame him. He thought his best bet to contain it would be to scoot dirt over the bodies. If he could cover them over with dirt, it would cut at least some of the smell. He pulled loose a couple of bars from his cage to use as digging instruments. He could dig at the side of the pit until he had enough dirt to cover the bodies. Though not particularly fastidious, he felt that a day or two of the stench might unhinge his mind. He was just about to begin digging at the wall of the pit when he heard the buzzing again and realized he had been wrong about the snakes. The light was gray, and so was the dust in the pit. In the gray dust, the snakes were almost invisible. One large rattler had been resting not a yard from where he stood. The snake started to crawl away, only rattling a little, not coiling, but Skull leapt at it and crushed its head with his stick. He knew he had to be careful. His eyes were apt to water when he focused too long on one thing. He couldn't see well enough to spot the snakes. He edged around the perimeter of the pit and killed 3 more snakes before he was done. Then he began to dig at the walls. By noon, when he had to quit and hide his eyes, the dead Mexicans lay buried under sizable mounds of earth. Before burying the men, Skull held his nose with one hand and forced himself to investigate their pockets. He was hoping Ahumado had overlooked a pocket knife or another file, but in that he was disappointed. All he got off the corpses was their belts. From time to time he dug, heaping more dirt on the corpses, but his time in the cage had weakened him. He could not dig long at a stretch, and no matter how careful he was, dirt got into his lidless eyes. The dust and dirt felt as painful as if it were gravel. Finally, he took off his shirt, tied it over his eyes, and dug at the walls blindly. By the afternoon, exhausted, he huddled in the shade. One of his ankles was inflamed. He had seen several scorpions and wondered if he had been bitten by one during the night when he was unconscious. He saw no sign of a bite, but the ankle was very sore, which chastened him. The pit seemed to be only 15 feet deep, only some 3 times his size. Perhaps he could dig a few handholds and pull himself out. But his throbbing ankle, coupled with his exhaustion and the beginnings of a fever, brought home to him again the desperate character of the situation. No sound at all came from what had been, only the day before, a bustling camp. There might be no one left to bring him water or food. The rangers might not have been able to get the cattle. No help might be coming. The pit he was in, though not really deep, was just deep enough to constitute the perfect trap for a man in his condition. Even if he could dig the handholds, he might not have the strength to climb out. His ankle would scarcely bear his weight. He could eat the snakes he had killed, but after that he would have nothing. Every day he would get a little weaker and have less and less hope of effecting his own escape. Barring a miracle, Ahumado had beaten him after all. The old man had even robbed him of time. As soon as Ahumado noticed that Skull was keeping a little calendar of twigs, he moved the cage and scattered the twigs. It was a thing to brood about. Ahumado had known that time meant something special to his prisoner. Now and then he would approach the cage and say, "Do you know what day it is, Captain?" Skull refused to answer, but Ahumado knew that Skull's hold on time had been broken. "I know what day it is," he would say quietly before returning to his blanket. That night, as Skull's fever rose, he dreamed of a flood. He dreamed that water filled the pit to its brim, cool water that allowed him to float free. 40 days and 40 nights, he mumbled, but he awoke to dry sunlight and pain in his eyes. The dirt he had got in them the day before left them swollen. "Noah," Skull said aloud. "I need what Noah had. I need a flood to raise me up." His own words sounded crazy to him. As his mind swirled, touching the edges of madness, he suddenly thought of Dolly, his Dolly, Inez to the world, but always Dolly to him. Even at that moment, as he lay starving in a scorpion pit in Mexico, she probably was in a bed or a closet, stoking her own fires with some stout, illiterate lad. "The black bitch," he said. Then, anger pulsing through him, he yelled the words as loudly as he could. "The black bitch! The bitch!" The sound echoed off the cliffs, where a few buzzards still circled. Then, dizzy from his own spurt of anger, Skull sat back against the wall of the pit, exhausted. In his mind, he saw exactly how the handhold should be dug, in an ascending circle around the pit. He stood 5'2". He only needed to raise himself a bit over 10 feet to escape. Nothing to what Hannibal had faced with his elephants at the base of the Alps. Yet it was those 10 feet that would defeat him. His eyes saw the way clearly, but his body, for the first time in his life, would not respond. Skull dozed. The heat of the day began to fill the pit. Soon it felt hot as a stovepipe to him. His fever rose. He felt chill even as he sweated. Once he thought he heard movement above him. He thought it might be a coyote or some other varmint inspecting the camp, hoping to find a scrap to eat. He yelled a time or two, though, on the off chance that it might be a human visitor. His yells produced no answer. Skull stood up to test his ankle, but immediately sat back down. His ankle would bear no weight. Then he began to get the feeling that he was not alone. Someone was above him, waiting where he couldn't see them. But the person, if it was a person, waited quietly, making no sound. Through the afternoon he turned his sore eyes upward a few times, but saw no one. Then, as dusk was approaching, he saw what he had sensed. A face, as old and brown as the earth, was visible above him. Then he remembered the old woman. He had seen her often during his days of captivity in the cage, but had paid her little mind. Most of the day the old woman sat under a small tree, silent. When she rose to do some chores, she walked slowly, bent almost double, supporting herself with a heavy stick. He rarely saw anyone speak to her. No doubt the people of the camp had left her to die. Crippled as she was, she would have been an impediment to travel. "Agua," he said, looking up at her. The sight of a human face made him realize how thirsty he was. "Agua! Agua!" The old face disappeared. Skull felt a flutter of hope. At least one human knew where he was, and that he was alive. There was no reason for the old woman to help him. She was probably dying herself. But she was there, and people were unpredictable. She might help him. Above him, old Zitla crept about the camp. She was glad the people had left. The camp was hers now. She had spent the day looking for things people had dropped as they were leaving. People were so careless. They left things that they considered had no use, but old Zitla knew that everything had a use if one were wise enough to know the uses of things. In a few hours of looking, she had already found a bullet, several nails, an old shirt, and a rawhide string. These things were treasures to Zitla. With each find, she hobbled eagerly back to her tree and put her treasure on her blanket. In her years in Ahumado's camp, Zitla had been careful never to tell him her name. She knew he would kill her immediately if he knew that her name was Zitla and that she was the daughter of Tilan, a great curandera who had known him in his youth in the south. Her mother had insisted that she take the name Zitla because it would protect her from Ahumado. When he was a baby, her mother told her the elders had put a poisoned leaf under Ahumado's tongue and sent him out in the world to do evil. Though Ahumado did not know it, he and Zitla had been born on the same minute of the same day, and their mothers were sisters. Thus their destinies were forever linked together. They would die on the same moment of the same day, too. In killing Zitla, Ahumado would have killed himself. But Tilan, her mother, when she sent Zitla away, warned her that she was never to tell Ahumado her real name or the circumstances of her birth. If Ahumado knew, he would try to challenge his destiny by putting Zitla to death in some cruel fashion. He bore the legacy of the poisoned leaf and would do much evil as a result. A few years back, Zitla thought Ahumado had found her out. He seldom rode a horse, yet one day, for no reason, Ahumado mounted a strong horse and rode the horse right over her, injuring her back so that she could never again stand straight. He had never explained his actions. He had merely ridden over her and left her in the dust. Then he dismounted and was never seen on a horse again. He had forbidden the people to help her, too. Zitla had crawled away on her hands and knees and found roots and leaves that helped her pain to be less. Around the camp, Zitla was known as Manuela. Because it was understood that Ahumado disapproved of her, she had few friends. Sometimes drunken vaqueros, men so debased that they would use any woman, or even a mare or a cow, came and pawed at her in the night. She had been small and dark, but very beautiful. The vaqueros saw something of her beauty and still pawed at her, even though she had passed her time as a woman. One or two of the other old grandmothers in the village spoke to her. They were too old to care about Ahumado or his wrath. Zitla's one companion was a small white cat. The little cat grew and became her hunter. It brought her the fattest rats and even now and then a baby rabbit, a delicacy Zitla cooked in her pot, seasoned with good spices. Her cat was Zitla's companion. It slept next to her head at night, and its thoughts went into her brain. The cat wanted her to leave the camp and go to a nearby village, but Zitla was afraid to go. She moved so slowly that it would take her many days to reach the village. Once Ahumado knew that she was gone, he might send his pistoleros to catch her and put her on one of the sharpened trees. That was the penalty for those who left without permission. A few weeks later, her cat left the camp to hunt and never came back. A woman told her much later that Ahumado had caught it and given it to a great rattler he kept in a cave. Zitla never knew whether the story was true. Even though she was old, many women in the camp were jealous of her because of her great beauty. Sometimes in the night, Zitla felt her cat trying to send its thoughts into her brain, but its thoughts were not clear. Another woman told her that the story about the great rattler was nonsense. There had been an old cougar living near the camp. The cougar had probably eaten her cat. This old woman, Sincha, had merely wanted gossip, Zitla thought. Like everyone else in the camp, Sincha was curious about Zitla and Ahumado. They wanted to know why the black vaquero hated Zitla so much, and why, if he hated her, didn't he just kill her? None of them knew about the sisters or the poisoned leaf, nor did they know the real reason for Ahumado's hatred, which was simple. Once, in his youth, Ahumado had tried to come to her in the way of a man, and she had stuck him in his member with a green thorn. She had been using the thorn to sew, and had merely stuck Ahumado with it because she did not want to be with him in that way. The green thorn had poison in it, and the poison went into Ahumado's member. He had several wives, but none of them were happy. There were stories and stories, but Zitla didn't know if they were true. She just knew that Ahumado hated her so badly that he had run her over with a horse. Now, to her surprise, Ahumado had been the one to leave the camp. He told no one that he was leaving. There was much speculation, but no one really knew why Ahumado did the things he did. Within a day, all the other people in the camp left too. No one offered to take Zitla. They had simply left her on her blanket. The women were particularly anxious to leave her. They did not like it that Zitla had such beauty of face still. Zitla had been asleep, dreaming of Parrot, when Ahumado pushed the white man into the pit. When she awoke, she heard the white man speaking to himself and knew that he was still alive. The white man had survived as Ahumado's captive for many weeks. He had a strong spirit in him. He might yet find a way to escape the pit. She could not resist peeking at him in the pit, and it was then that he asked her for water. There were 3 or 4 pots laying around the camp, pots people had left in their careless haste. Zitla took one of the pots and filled it with water from the stream. Then she searched through her treasures until she found enough rawhide string to make a cord long enough to lower the water to the white man. It would please her to help the prisoner in the pit, but when she lowered the water and looked at the man, she realized it would not be easy to save him. He was very weak. He was on the point of giving up, this man. But Zitla hoped that a little cool water and some food would bring his spirit back its strength. It took Zitla a long time to get the water, moving slowly as she did, and she was careful when she lowered it into the pit. When the white man stood up to catch the jug, Zitla saw that one of his ankles was injured. He could not put his foot on the ground without pain, a fact which complicated his escape. It would be hard for him to climb out of the pit with such a sore ankle. Zitla decided to take the blanket and go to the little cornfield by the stream. The corn was young, but it was the only food close to the camp that she might bring him. She would pile some of the soft corn on her blanket and drag it to the pit so that the man would have something to eat. She could stay alive on very little, and the white man could too, or he would have already starved. "Gracias, gracias," Skull said when the water jug was safely in his hands. He took the water in little sips, just a drop or 2 at a time, to soothe his swollen tongue. His tongue was so thick that he could barely speak his words of thanks. It was a good sign that Skull was careful with the water, Zitla thought. He was disciplined. If she could get him a little corn, his spirit might revive. That night Zitla listened carefully to the animal noises around the camp. She wanted to be awake in case Ahumado came back. He had always been a night raider. He struck at the most peaceful hour, when people were deep in restful sleep. Young women dreaming of lovers would not know anyone was there until the hard hands of the pistoleros took them away into slavery, far from their villages and their lovers. People were not alert enough to sense the approach of Ahumado, but animals could sense it. All the animals knew that Ahumado had been given the poison leaf and did evil things. Sometimes he made Goyeto tie up animals and skin them for practice. The animals knew better than to let such an old man catch them. The coyotes stayed away, and the skunks, and even the rats. The night birds didn't sing when Ahumado was around. Zitla listened carefully and was reassured. There were plenty of animals out that night, enjoying the bright moon. Just beyond the cornfield where she meant to go in the morning with her blanket, there were some coyotes playing, yipping at one another, teasing and calling out. She watched a skunk pass by and heard an owl from a tree near the cliff. Hearing the sounds of the animals made Zitla feel peaceful, content to doze by her little fire of twigs and branches. She didn't know where Ahumado had gone or why, but it was enough for the moment to know that he was far away. In the morning she would go to the cornfield with her blanket and pick some corn for the white man, Captain Skull.